Hi everyone, today we are finally going to talk about The Empire of Gold by S.A Chakraborty, the conclusion to the Daevabad Trilogy. I have been waiting for this book, I guess for about a year and a half, because I read the second one, The Kingdom of Copper, right when it came out, and it ended on a pretty terrible cliffhanger, and ever since then I have basically just been waiting for this book to release. I've talked a lot recently about how much I love this series and what it has meant to me, and I just did a video last week about the background and lore of the series, so if you haven't read it at all, that's probably a good place to start. I'm going to try to make this review as spoiler-free as possible. I think the best way to do that is I'll divide it up into 3 sections. I will first do a completely spoiler-free review that won't spoil anything in the entire trilogy for you, so if you haven't read any of the books but you want to know, how the series ends, but not the details, but just if you'll like it or not, then you can watch that. Then I'll do another section that will contain spoilers for books 1 and 2, but will not contain any spoilers for Empire of Gold. And then I'll probably end with a section where I will do complete spoilers. So I will put timestamps in the comments so you'll be able to figure out where you want to stop watching this video. Speaking of spoilers, I have been the worst about spoilers ever since I was a little kid. I was totally the person that would flip to the back of the book pretty early on and just read the ending, which honestly really doesn't help at all because the actual ending doesn't usually matter that much. It's more about how you get there. And I think the only thing that broke me of that habit was probably as an adult when I started reading more ebooks. You can flip to the end of an ebook, but it's just not, as comfortable when you're kind of holding your place and you're just like, oh, I wonder who dies. So anyway, it was really hard not to flip to the end of this book. I controlled myself pretty well, but I don't know if I'm ever going to get over that. This is also my first time trying to review book 3 of a series I really love, so I will try to make this more than just a list of things I liked about it and add a little more value. But please enjoy me getting to be really excited about this, I guess. So for those of you who are wondering, is the Daevabad Trilogy a good investment of my time? I would say absolutely yes. I really think that book 3 was a satisfying conclusion. And if you've seen my videos about the series recently, you know that I was really scared that book 3 wasn't going to be a satisfying conclusion and that it would somehow wreck the rest of the series for me. I think the character arcs were really, really satisfying. I think in some ways book 3 has the best character writing, and it was the book in which I liked pretty much all of the characters the most. I totally loved the setting of this. I loved the setting and world building of this trilogy throughout, but for me the characters were something that continued to improve as the series went on. I love that in this series characters are able to occasionally talk things out and deal with difficult things and come to decisions without having these typical book-long series of misunderstandings and miscommunications. And I feel like, especially in this book, the characters were able to make their own decisions about what they wanted to do without just constantly being forced into terrible situations the whole time, even though some of the things they were facing were pretty terrible. I also thought that by this point in the series, a lot of the important characters had managed to evolve into being kind of a combination of idealistic and pragmatic without being totally one or the other. One thing I will say about the series as a whole is that given all the things that went on in it, it does tie up pretty neatly, maybe even more neatly than you would expect, but I also thought the payoff was really good, so that didn't bother me at all, but I did see some reviews from people saying they were surprised by how neatly it wrapped up. This series is very heavily focused on politics, definitely more so than on things like romance. I was very satisfied with the amount of politics versus romance, especially in this last book, but it is definitely not purely a romantic series. I was really happy that romance didn't become something that just completely overpowered every other consideration for the characters, that things like politics and actual situations and decisions they needed to make played a more important role than just how they felt about someone. Another thing that was really great about the conclusion to this series was the way the world building continued to expand in each book. In each book, you keep going back to Daevabad, but there are also new settings and new places to explore in ways that feel really organic to the world, but also are really fun to discover. I also have loved how mythology and lore got used in this series, and I really enjoyed some of the things that were added in this book. There was some ancient Egyptian mythology that got thrown in there, and that's just something I've been really obsessed with throughout the whole series. So before I move on to some spoilers for people that have read books 1 and 2, my pitch for why you should read this series, probably the best world building I've seen in any series in a long time, especially something that is technically set in our world but has a fantastical element on it. The use of mythology and culture is just completely mind-blowing to me. The characters are complex. I think you'll come to like them more and more as the series continues. There's a lot of politics and intrigue. The characters are memorable and likable and complex, and I think you'll come to like them more and more the more you read the series. There are some very complex villains as well, and there's romance enough that should satisfy you, but it doesn't take over the story. For me, I just got obsessed with the world from the beginning and just didn't want to leave it. I wanted to spend more time in it, but that being said, this is a very satisfying conclusion to the series. I don't think there really will be or should necessarily be any more books in the series, but it's a good one to reread. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about a few more details that will spoil the ending of book 2. So if you haven't read books 1 and 2 and you don't want to be spoiled, you should probably stop watching now. So where we left off at the end of book 2 was that Manijah and Dara have invaded Daevabad, Ghassan has been killed, and Nari and Ali have been mysteriously transported to Egypt after Nari defies Manijah and gets Ali to take the Seal of Suleiman instead of taking it herself. A lot of things come full circle for Nari in this book, including a resolution of the life in Cairo that she had left behind towards the beginning of book 1 and kind of revisits at the beginning of book 3. She also learns a lot more about her origins throughout this book, and I will say that some things about that really surprised me, but I think it was well done. I really came to love Nari's character here in book 3. I was always fine with her as a character. I liked her, but I felt like, especially in book 1, she was kind of more of a cliche thief orphan character, kind of like a typical protagonist of a fantasy book, and I didn't think that the character writing necessarily rose above that for her, even though I did like her as a character. But especially here in book 3, I thought she became very complex. I thought that Chakraborty really integrated a lot of the aspects of her character, both her origins as a thief, who she is as a healer, who she is as a Nahid. All of those things kind of came together into one cohesive whole that felt very unique and very Nari. And there were also elements of her character and personality we got to see throughout. One thing that did eventually get pointed out to her by another character, but was just kind of in there, was she has this inability to ever really accept kindness or help from somebody without feeling like she needs to make a trade with them in return, like she's not able to just accept things. And that really says a lot about who she is as a person, and there are a lot of really great character moments like that. I felt like throughout the series, Nari was always the pragmatic, practical one, and Ali, and to some extent Dara, were the sort of idealistic, fanatical ones. And I felt like in this book, those lines started to shift, where they each started to take on some aspects of each other's characters. So that is really a good example of how characters can change and grow. Another thing I really liked about Nari in book 3 is that even though all of this stuff is going down, she's dealing with a lot, she still gets to decide what she wants out of her life. She doesn't ever give up on making decisions about what it is that she wants to do. I also really loved Ali in this book, and he was a character that could be pretty annoying, especially in book 1 and sometimes in book 2, because he was always trying to do the right thing, whatever he thought the right thing was, and he was terrible at politics, and he never seemed to learn, and he just made the same mistakes over and over and over again. So he didn't really ever let go of that idealism, but I think he just became a lot more useful of a character. He grew up a lot, and I just liked him a lot more. Also, getting to see him visit the human world at the beginning of the book is really amazing. One of the most powerful scenes in the book, and for his character to me, is this moment where he hears the call to prayer in Cairo, and he is sort of hearing the differences between the human call to prayer and what he's used to hearing in Daevabad, but then him also a little later going to a mosque surrounded by all these humans, and they can't really see him. He's blending in, but he is connecting. He's part of something that's bigger than both humans and jinn, and connecting to something really universal for him, but also it's at a time where he is mourning the loss of his family and his city, and he's going through all these things, and it's just a very powerful scene emotionally. It's a bit hard to describe. You should read the book. There's also a scene where Ali and Nari talk about the Deva religion, and Nari is explaining some of the cultural practices of her religion as she learned them, and Ali is actually relating to it and saying like, wow, that's really beautiful. And I mean, if you remember where Ali was in book 1, that never would have happened. So it's just really cool to see in small moments like that how a character can grow and mature. And then after Kingdom of Copper, I was pretty willing to write off Dara, even though I have always liked him as a character because just of where he got to. But amazingly, he actually grew and changed a lot in this book as well, and he was probably the character you would think would be least able to make any meaningful change. So now I'm going to get into some spoilers for Empire of Gold, so please don't watch this unless you are a spoiler junkie like me or you've already read Empire of Gold. So I've just sent my husband out of the room because he has read books 1 and 2 and he hasn't read this yet. Usually he is behind the camera just keeping an eye on things and doing the sound for me. But I almost let him listen to the spoilers, and then I felt really, really bad because I want him to have the pleasure of being surprised. So he's hiding in the other room, hopefully with headphones in. One thing that I just thought was super cute, although it's not incredibly relevant to anything, is that the Shedu that Nari gets towards the end of the book that she names Mishmish. The word Mishmish means apricot, and I just thought that was the cutest name ever. It's adorable, especially because she's naming like this mythical winged lion creature. And I just think that is the greatest name for a pet, and I'm going to have to use it someday. One thing that was a little bit contrived in some ways was the Perry's intervention at the end of the book to help wrap everything up. I do think that it was in some ways foreshadowed, especially because of Kaiser's role in book 1, and that the Perrys intervene to some extent and kill him for interfering, but we haven't heard much of them since then, so it was kind of interesting that they came back. But it was also kind of funny that they are basically complete assholes and they basically interfere while pretending they have a non-intervention policy. So yeah, that was a little bit tidy, but I enjoyed the scene with them. I really enjoyed Nari's reaction to them and her not being afraid to point out the issues in some of how they handle things. I also loved Sobek, the Merid, who is Ali's ancestor and who is the one who cursed Nari's appearance to be human. In ancient Egyptian mythology, Sobek is the crocodile-headed god of the Nile, and that's basically the role he had in this book too, I guess. But I just thought the Merid had this presence in the book that felt even older and more mythological and epic than the Jinn. They felt like they were representing the dawn of civilization almost. They felt like something bigger and more primordial, and I liked getting to see a little bit more of that. Sobek was just a really cool character. He's definitely doing things for his own reasons, and he definitely operates by a code that is a lot different than either human or jinn. And then we have Dara. There's a line towards the end where Nari says something like, "I was prepared to kill you, and then you had to go and do the right thing." That was basically my reaction to Dara in this book. After 2 books and almost a couple thousand years of being fanatically devoted to doing whatever the Nahids say, he finally manages to start developing a conscience and start trying to do the right thing, even though it takes him most of the book to actually get there. He's always been willing to abdicate his moral responsibility to whatever Nahid is telling him what to do at the time, and he's a little too willing to use that as an excuse, even though yes, he was brainwashed as a child totally, yes, he was 18 when he got sent to perform all sorts of atrocities, which you have to remember in the Deva, in the Jinn culture, he wasn't even legally of age. He was probably the equivalent of maybe like 15 or 16 for a human. But even so, he did do terrible things, and he does have to come to terms with that, obviously. I thought it was handled well, because most of the characters, especially the older ones in this book, have done terrible things, and none of them really got a free pass. In the end, they kind of all had to go. But you can also see from Dara's perspective, there was always a little more complexity to him than he even gave himself credit for. You can even see in the original destruction of Queasy, which is the thing that he's known in history as being a monster for. From his perspective, he actually let some of the pure-blooded jinn live, and he brought them back to Daevabad, even though his instructions were to kill everyone. So, of course, that doesn't excuse the terrible things he did, but also he operated according to his own code as best he understood it of what was right, and then because of that, and not just blindly obeying orders, he basically then became known as being a monster. So ironically, if he had completely followed his orders and just burned the place to the ground, maybe it never would have been known what he did there, which was really horrible. Basically everything that has happened to Dara in this series and before, it's just all heartbreaking. I was so sure that his ending would involve him dying to sacrifice himself for Nari and maybe Ali, because that seemed like a typical redemption arc, and I wasn't sure where else Chakraborty could even go with that character. But to be honest, I was so much happier with what did happen than with my imagined, well, I don't know where she's going to go with this other than just have him sacrifice himself and then he'll be out of the way and we won't have to deal with what he did. So in a way, the fact that he didn't die and that he continues to live after the series and is trying to do something good as best he can and make something meaningful out of his life, that's really amazing. I think if he had just had a typical redemption arc where he sacrificed himself, he wouldn't have ever gotten to reclaim his agency. He wouldn't have really had any ability to take ownership for what he did. Full confession, the part of my brain that is still 16 instead of 29, somewhere deep down in there, totally wanted Dara to end up with Nari. I also knew that was a terrible idea, a really unhealthy relationship, and that should never ever happen. So I am happy with how things ended up, but I'll just put it out there. 16-year-old me would have been so into Dara as the sort of immortal, broken bad boy with a dark past. And I think all of us are probably a little bit loving Dara for that reason. But the way that he manages to finally trick and bring down Manijah at the end is so satisfying and just a really great scene. And of course, all these other characters have been telling him for the entire book, dude, just stop listening to her. You don't have to do what she says just because she's a Nahid. And of course, it took her actually enslaving him and completely abusing him for him to get to that point, but thank God, at least he got there. We wish he'd gotten there 2 books ago, but we'll take it when we can get it. I had the feeling that Muntadir was not going to die, and I think the fact of the removal of magic from Daevabad, also meaning that he was no longer magically poisoned, was a pretty convenient way to do it. I don't have a lot to say about him in this book. I really enjoyed his interactions with Dara. I'm really happy that he and Jamshid had a relatively happy ending, and I liked the fact that their feelings for each other managed to survive all of these terrible situations, their parents and their factions being at war with each other, and all of this other terrible crap, and that they were still able to somehow build a strong relationship. So I was pretty surprised with where we ended up politically at the end of book 3. I was not expecting Daevabad to go towards a more democratic system where all the tribes are going to get a say, including the Shafit. But I also think that was the only way, really thinking about it, that it could have possibly ended. And when you think about it, this book is now set in the very early 1800s. The French Revolution has happened, the American Revolution has happened. Humans are moving towards all sorts of political systems in this world, and the jinn have always been very influenced by the human world, whether they admit it or not. There's a cool part where Cartier the priest, I think he's talking to Manijah, but anyway, he's saying, like, why do you think the Deva religion is our true original religion? Just like Islam is original to humans, and that's what the Gaziri and other tribes practice. He says something like, Do you think that our ancestors who didn't have mortal bodies had these palaces made out of brick and stone? Everything about our culture is taken from the humans. And so I think the inevitable thing that's going to happen in this world is that the jinn are just going to become more and more like humans, and maybe eventually they will be indistinguishable from humans. You already have the Shafit becoming more and more populous. You know that the magic of the jinn seems to basically be weakening in each successive generation. Even Dara, who seems to have original powers, he's supposedly not as strong as the first generation of jinn were. So leaving this series forever, it's hard to be optimistic about how the government of Daevabad is going to work out, but at least it seems like Ali and Nari are pretty into it, and I was happy that there was a way for them to be idealistic and not end up at a perfect situation, but not accept that there was nothing better than the horrible kings and leadership of the past, so they had to try to do something that was more fair. There was also acknowledgement that pretty much everything about the old system was bad. Even how Hatset, Ali's mother, basically, even though she hated what her husband did, she was totally willing for Ali to do the same policies if it was going to protect him, because she cared more about him staying alive. And that was a trade-off that Ali and Nari just weren't willing to make. It was also really interesting how the Devas reacted to Dara and Manija taking over the city, which was basically, they did not greet them with open arms. They were not super thrilled to have them back. They had been basically okay with Ghassan and the Gaziri being in charge. They were doing fine. And that was so hard for Dara to deal with, because what he really wanted was things to be the way they were 1400 years ago, or maybe the way he had thought as a kid they were supposed to be 1400 years ago. And he becomes aware pretty quickly that that's just not going to happen. And I think for both him and Manija, it's like the ultimate betrayal that they've done everything to create this world that it turns out is actually really terrible and everyone hates them and they're just causing more problems. I think it's like the ultimate betrayal for Dara and Manija when they see they've done all this stuff, all these horrible things to create a world that they think is going to be better, and everyone will hail them as heroes, and instead everyone just thinks they're absolutely awful people. But you have to have some sympathy for what Manija went through as well. Chakraborty has said in interviews that Manija is basically what Nari would have been if she had been under Ghassan's thumb for, a few hundred years instead of just a couple. And she witnessed some really terrible things, her brother being constantly tortured. We get to understand a lot more about her character in this book. It's just that Dara really wants to think that Manija is redeemable, and it turns out she totally isn't. The last thing I should probably mention, I was really happy with how the romance between Nari and Ali was handled. I wasn't sure throughout the book, were they even going to get together? And in the end, they kind of did, but it was very slow and it was very much for the future, and it felt really real to me. We're not completely sure that they will end up together, but it seems like there is now a world in which that's possible, and we'll just see what happens in our imaginations, I guess. So it felt like a pretty good place to leave the book. Nari also got to connect more to her real mother's history and to meet her grandfather and realize she wasn't just a Nahid, she was also Egyptian and a human. So it was a really nice place to end, and I'm really sorry to see this series go, but it felt like it ended on a high. I hope that you guys enjoyed it. I really loved this series. If any of you have read this series due to my recommendation and are now watching this video, I really hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching. I am really sorry to say goodbye to this, but it's been a good ride.